Welcome, members of the community, local faith community leaders, UCSB colleagues, and welcome to the home team, Westmont faculty, staff, administrators, and students. Good to be with you here giving this third talk in the Gender Studies lecture series. I am honored to follow such insightful and compelling and challenging discussions of gender representations, language, and experience that my colleagues have offered this term from within the religious studies and sociology departments. First, a few introductory comments before I launch into the talk. My lecture tonight will take up the representation of gender and sexuality within one late medieval, early modern text, within the field of English literary criticism and theory. As many of you know, gender studies takes all aspects of gender experience and representation as its primary category of inquiry. And because sexuality is so closely connected to gender identity and experience, sexuality studies usually fall under the category of gender studies. At least, the two fields of study are inextricably connected. And our previous lectures by Drs. Reeder and Whitna certainly illustrated the ways that gender and sexuality, via wartime rape, via the social and domestic relations that often create the context of gender-based violence, are intimately connected. Tonight's talk is situated in the branch of gender studies that analyzes transgender identity and representation, alongside a part of sexuality studies that analyzes the history and representation of lesbian or female same-sex sexuality. And this talk represents part of my area of specialization at Cornell University, as well as part of my ongoing research about how bodies are deployed in medieval romance. I've chosen to think with you about these topics tonight for several reasons, and here I'll just outline for you the most foundational reasons that make this talk possible. And I can be more explicit after the talk about the reasons for the content of my argument, but here I'm addressing first this talk as inherently both possible and nearly obligatory. First, perhaps most basically, because these ideas represent legitimate fields of inquiry in the academy, and it is my job to bring my whole self to the marketplace of ideas, to contribute to those discussions and to invite you, students and colleagues, into that conversation tonight. And it is my pleasure to do so. Secondly, because we claim that our gender studies minor will, quote, prepare students to step into significant conversations and activities happening in academia and in the public sphere. And we all in the gender studies minor, take that commitment seriously. Third, we study these topics because they represent not only historical or textual identities and experiences, but also incarnated identities and experiences in the present. And those experiences and those people matter to us. They are us. And fourth, perhaps most importantly tonight, we study these topics because we take seriously our community life statement, which describes this community as marked by love, justice, and mercy, enacted primarily in our posture towards learning and towards each other. And here I quote directly from the community life statement. Quote, learning depends on truth-centered attitudes. It thrives in an atmosphere of discriminating openness to ideas, a condition that is characterized by a measure of modesty towards one's own views, the desire to affirm the true, and the courage to examine the unfamiliar. This model of learning is also marked by what former Westmont professor and administrator Jim Manoia has called an epistemological humility when approaching new ideas, a kind of open-handed willingness to engage honestly with new ways of knowing, to listen well with our commitments held humbly. And the community life statement calls that learning posture our, quote, commitment to inquiry as well as pronouncement. It is in the grand spirit of inquiry that my talk is offered. This lecture is primarily experimental, theoretical, a thought experiment. It is not primarily historical, but I know the historians in the room will help us to think historically about the paper in the Q&A. My question is this: what do we get when we bring two seemingly disparate texts and ideas in conversation? A late medieval English romance about a cross-dressing knight and contemporary transgender theory responding to lesbian theories. How does the theory help us to understand something about the medieval text that we may not otherwise have captured? And how does the medieval text talk back to the modern theory, respond perhaps with yes and, with similarity and its own radical alterity? How might that trans-temporal conversation matter to readers today, to us, and to the particular us, the me and the you, of the place in which I'm reading now, a primarily Christian space? What happens to this conversation when we engage with it here? Does this medieval-modern exchange have anything to say to the way that Christians read? And can we imagine how Christians read at all? The story of Ide and Olive is an unusual one in the corpus of medieval transvestite narratives. While we have many medieval texts, from romances to saints' lives, in which the hero or heroine cross-dresses, usually to escape some kind of unwanted sexual attention, or in the case of some abandoned wives, to search for their husbands. Not many depict that cross-dressing passing as male, to be so successful as to attract the gift of a wife by an admiring lord. Not many include lengthy descriptions of the 14 nights of honeymoon the newly wedded couple enjoy. Nor do hardly any medieval cross-dressing stories conclude with a divine intervention in which the female-born cross-dressing Ide is transgendered by an angel, continuing the rest of her narrative life as husband to Olive, as the emperor of Rome, and as the progenitor of a line of chanson de geste heroes. There are a few other sexual transformation stories, Ovid's Iphis and Ianthus, from which this story may derive, Tristan de Nanteuil, La Reine d'Orient, among others. But what has marked Ide and Olive out for, albeit scant, scholarly attention is almost always its stated potential as an incipient female homoerotic narrative. And it is one of the earliest medieval stories that seems to acknowledge that women might experience an erotic desire for each other and have the ability to act out those desires in a way corresponding to a modern category called lesbian. This argument is not inconsequential. Several scholars, Diane Watt, in conversation with Eve Sedgwick's groundbreaking book Epistemology of the Closet, along with Soutman and Scheingorn in their 2001 book Same-Sex Love and Desire Among Women in the Middle Ages, have all variously argued that because there is little to no medieval grammar via which medieval women might have expressed same-sex desire, only silence, obscuring vocabulary, or what they call shrouding, historians often conclude that there were no lesbians. That is, the absence of texts or language naming lesbian desire means for us now the absence of lesbians in the past, means a kind of erasure of female homosexuality. In that context, Ide and Olive's story offers a potent counter-narrative, a narrative that stays for several hundred lines with the sexual possibilities of what could easily be read as two women who have married and who spend 15 nights, quote, embracing and kissing, before Ide's eventual membering as a man. Watt smartly points out that the courtly audience of the poem, and I mean those that the story represents as seeing Ide, as reading her body first as masculine, then as female, seem to read the desire and the behavior of Ide and Olive with a clear sense that two women desiring and enjoying sex together was thinkable. The emperor responds to the revelation that he, quote, will not such boggery to be used, using one of the very few words, buggery, available to him to describe what he thinks has happened. And if you would like, I can point you to Watt's article for a helpful discussion of the word buggery, its history, and why its usage here, quote, provides one of the earliest explicit references to sexual relations between women in the English language. My point here is not to question the real value, both historical and political, in claiming this story as one of the first in a genealogy of medieval English lesbian narratives, as it begins to undo the perhaps too facile notion that the putative absence of medieval discourse about female same-sex desire precludes the absence of that desire itself, sustained and enacted in visible and invisible, measurable and immeasurable ways. Ide and Olive does, at the least, provide an instance in which we see represented many of the characters' reaction to what they understand as potential female homosexual activity, suggesting the medieval community's acknowledgement of that activity as a real possibility for medieval women. What does strike me as curious in most of the scholarship around this narrative is the way in which these analyses gesture towards reading Eid as a gender-ambiguous individual, but then nearly always capitulate to making sense of Eid's story via a sexual category that depends upon the precise gender identities that Eid seems to resist throughout the narrative. That is, according to these readings, cross-dressing and cross-behaving Eid may be gender-flexible, but in the end, she is always a woman, always understood to experience herself finally as a woman, in love with a woman. I am troubled by what may be lost from Eid's self-presentation by the imposition of a fixed gender-based sexual category, in this case female homosexual or lesbian, that may silence or ignore just as much about Eid's complex being as it voices or brings to light. And I worry about a reading practice that extends the confining, even violent logic of the narrative court in insisting that Eid finally be read as female. What I will argue is that Eid's gender ambiguity extends beyond even Eid's transgendering, that there is no evidence that Eid experiences selfhood as a woman, and that ultimately, if we are to approach Eid's own gender or sexual desires, we come to the space of mystery and of unknowability. And that unknowing, as a hermeneutic, is where the title of my talk comes in. Tonight I'm interested in exploring the limits of a taxonomy of gender or sexual identification. If Eid does more than pass as a man, becoming culturally intelligible as the, quote, ideal of manhood, while expressing exclusive desire to remain in that performance, is it possible, perhaps even preferable, to read Eid not as a lesbian but as a transgender individual? And it raises the ancillary question, how as readers would we recognize the difference between cross-dressing lesbian and trans man? I am not interested in simply replacing one category for another or in pitting categories against each other in that kind of mean-spirited choosing of sides that features in the schoolyard, where Eid gets chosen for team transgender and team lesbian has to go for a second draft pick. My question is rather, might we get closer to capturing not only how Eid might self-identify, but also to the fullness of how Eid's being can resonate if we move away from fixed sexual categories and enter into the space of the trans figure? Medieval literary critic Carolyn Dinshaw has written about the importance of attending to a residue after the imposition of categories, attending to what is left out, the leavings of categories. Tonight I would like to consider the excess or overflow of self that remains uncharted, unchartable perhaps, in readings of Eid's identity that focus on Eid as an embodiment of same-sex or proto-lesbian desire. I'd like to worry with you about what is lost or made too neatly congruent in that process, compulsion even, of making sense, perhaps too quickly, out of an individual who may have staked his or her claim to being outside the neat bounds of easily gendered legibility. I'd like to trace what might be gained and perhaps lost by reading this being as a transgender individual, to trace the limits of knowability along one kind of trans axis. And finally, I'll suggest how this kind of reading might have anything to do with a specifically Christ-infused reading practice. And I'd like to reiterate that I'm doing just one kind of trans reading here. There are possible many kinds of trans responses to my argument. I'm particularly in conversation tonight with Judith Halberstam's book, In a Queer Time and Place, and particularly Halberstam's chapter on refusing set taxonomies of being when facing the trans individual in film and in life. First, an outline of the story. I'm reading from the 16th century English translation of the earlier 13th century Old French version. A late 14th century dramatic version of the story, called the Miracle de la Fille d'un Roi, was also commissioned by a confraternity of Paris goldsmiths in the 1370s. And the story has a longer life in French translations and theatrical adaptations. Tonight's English version, with which this paper engages, was printed in England 3 times throughout the 16th century, with the last printing in 1601. We know that Shakespeare was familiar with the epic, A note in Philip Henslow's diary lists the performance of a play titled after the story in 1593. Here is the story. Ede is the daughter of King Florence of Navarre, her mother Clariot having died in childbirth. By the age of 15, Ede resembles her beautiful mother to such an extent that her father, Florence, resolves that he will take only Ede as his second wife. To escape his incestuous desire, Ede adopts male clothing and accoutrement and flees her father's kingdom, hoping to make her fortune at the court of Rome. After joining a group of German mercenaries and fighting a band of Spanish thieves who attempt to rob her along the way, Ede arrives at the court of the Roman emperor. Via both her displays of military might and courtly manners and speech, Ede quickly garners reputation, honors, and the amorous attention of the king of Rome's daughter, Olive. When the king offers Olive to Ede in marriage, Olive is delighted, and the newlyweds spend 15 nights in each other's arms, kissing and embracing, with Ede pleading ill in order to excuse her reluctance to engage in the intercourse that Olive seems to expect. When Olive will no longer be put off, Ede breaks down and tells her everything. Olive responds by affirming her relationship to Ede as her, quote, right sweet lover, and promises never to betray Ede because, quote, we are wedded together, and because, she says to Ede, quote, you have kept yourself so truly. But their pillow conversation is overheard, and Olive's father plans to reveal Ede's secret in a public bath, and then to burn them both for their deceit, and that's where the word buggery comes in. At the last moment, an angel intervenes in Ede's public unveiling and announces that God has turned her into a man. Everyone rejoices, and with her new and hyperpotent penis, Ede engenders a son upon Olive that very night. I am not the first reader to comment upon the gender ambiguity created in this story, and this argument requires that I spend some time outlining the extent of that ambiguity. William Robbins, in his 2009 Exemplaria article, traces the impact of visibility upon the non-normative sexual self, suggesting that Ede's identity doesn't ultimately look for or certainly achieve coherence as either male or female, public or private self. Rather, he maintains, Ede exists as a deterritorialized, divided, and multiple being. In a similar vein, Diane Watt has argued in 2 helpful essays that the text elides the distinction between Ede performing like a man and Ede becoming a man, noting that her appearance and performance are distinctly gender ambiguous, even androgynous, from well before her cross-dressing, so that, quote, Ede's reiterated performance produces a body that is at times, but only at times, culturally intelligible as male. Yet Watt and Robbins consistently read this gender ambiguity as legible only as a ground for female homosexuality. Watt wonders, and not unjustifiably, if cross-dressing might be a way to legitimize same-sex desire, appropriating male dress in order to make socially acceptable the appropriation of male desire for women, while also arguing that female transvestites, though, quote, posing a problem for analysis, also, quote, provide a point of entry into lesbian history. But why only lesbian history? Why can't the female transvestite open horizons for potential trans history as well? The incoherent or multiple or uncategorizable selfhood that Robbins describes as, quote, female homosexual, or the appropriation of male prerogatives would seem to invite an exploration of precisely the individual that Judith Halberstam and others name as transgendered. In the terrain of the female-to-male trans figure, Halberstam includes those individuals born female who experience, quote, prolonged male identification and think of themselves as male, unquote, and potentially even, quote, female-born people who think of themselves as masculine but not necessarily male, and certainly not female. Might we not read Ede in this light? If we insist on the category same-sex to describe Ede's sexual desires, we continue to assume that Ede's gender is located in Ede's natural and biologically determined sex, that Ede's sex is legible at all, in a narrative in which the incoherent terrain of gender embodiment and performance is precisely what the story sustains throughout. Or even more to my point, is there a third set of questions we might ask of this individual that move beyond naming altogether? The possibility of a trans reading leads me to wonder to what extent Ede experiences him or herself as female, or as male, or as the both and of an identity position infinitely more complicated? And what language do we use in that space of the both and, as it relates to gender experience, that would allow Ede to be fully him or herself in all the irreducible complexity of that self? Time constraints will limit me from tracing in detail Ede's gender identification and performance from beginning to end, and they are many. Here I will offer only a sketch. First, like Watt and Robbins, I am compelled to discuss the pervasive gender flexibility in the narrative, which I would argue begins in the English version at the time of her transvesticism. The text relates that after a bath, meant to prepare her for her conjugal evening with her father, she dresses as a squire, arms herself, and escapes from the court out of a window. Watt and others write about the bathing scenes as indicative of a kind of baptismal or transformational moment often linked to sexuality, as bathing is often part of a preparatory ritual for wedding night intercourse. We might then feel free to read Ede's strapping on the sword after such a sexually charged transformational moment as indicative of an especially gender-charged sartorial choice that is initiated here and sustained throughout the narrative. Thereafter, the text presents Ede as actively seeking out opportunities to perform her masculine identity, both with the German mercenaries and then repeatedly at the Roman court. That is to say, cross-dressing doesn't seem to function as a disguise for Ede, a way for him to blend in or shrink from sight or to become less himself. Enacting maleness seems to perform Ede's self-sustained desires, provides Ede opportunities to seek out desired communities of affiliation and modes of being. Upon meeting the German soldiers, Ede claims that, quote, "I can well serve a gentleman and keep his horse, and if I come in battle or in skirmish with my master, I think he shall have worse than I in his company." And Ede succeeds in these claims. Ede is, in fact, the only character in the whole of the narrative who is depicted wielding sword and spear on the battlefield. As Ede plunges his sword, quote, "clean through bodies, cleaves brain pans to the teeth, cuts off hands, litters the battlefield with body parts and viscera." The text also seems to see Ede's martial prowess as indicative of Ede's masculinity. Later, it is precisely Ede's, quote, "high virtue or manliness and prowess that make the fact of his biological womanness so difficult for the barons to understand." This immediate and successful passing as male extends such that Ede occupies the position of homosocial foil or proxy for the male leaders in the text, first for the chief of the Spanish thieves, and later for the Roman emperor himself. That is, the emperor is so pleased with Ede's masculine performance as to command his soldiers, quote, "on pain of your lives, to do everything that he," that is Ede, "commandeth in the stead of me, as well as though I did command you mine own person." More than just passing at this point, Ede here exhibits social sexual potency. Ede fills in as the able proxy male for the emperor, who is now too old and feeble to protect his daughter from impending sexual assault. Ede's military service and high honor result in Ede being named, quote, "the mirror for all other knights, to encourage them to do well." By the end of this section, Ede is not only passing for proxy father, Ede explicitly serves as a model of masculinity for every other male figure in the story. Taken together, this passing, then substantial social sexual potency, then idealized masculine identification, calls readers to experience Ede as a masculine individual, as a male individual. Yet at the same time, the text's play with gendered language contributes to the overall sense of gender ambiguity surrounding Ede. Female pronouns and the repeated epithet demoiselle shift often enough into male pronouns and reminders that Ede is, quote, "a mirror for all knights," unquote, as to render Ede more gender shimmery or gender mysterious than gender fixed, a kind of shimmering that is not closed down even after Ede is proclaimed divinely transgendered. At the moment when the angel rescues Ede from unveiling, he announces that Ede will be changed, quote, "in nature and become a perfect man as all other be, without any difference," unquote. Significant to the English version of this story is that there is no mention of Eid receiving a penis, no revelation, textually, physically, or rhetorically, as there is in the French version, that Eid experiences any biological transformation at all. The French version riffs on versions of the word membre to show us precisely what Eid has acquired in the transformation, and the English version does not. Eid is already a mirror for other knights, already admired for prowess and size and strength and virtue. I suggest that this transgendering works to highlight how very proximate to maleness, certainly masculinity, Eid has already come, serves to highlight the smallness of the threshold between genders. Thus, in the next lines, when, quote, Eid and Olive went to bed together and took their sport, unquote, for the 16th night, after Eid is transformed, one is left wondering what, if anything, has changed between them. Eid's body continues in its obscurity, its mystery, as Eid is neither revealed to the audience as a woman or as a man, so that the angelic pronouncement that Eid is now a man is just that, a verbal proclamation, a speech act. But any biological or physiognomic transformation is left unspoken, hidden, and opaque. And Eid's body, as well as whatever identity Eid experiences emanating from within that body, or from without it, is just as incomprehensible as before. The text's language with the continued names, the resumed desire, the resumed conjugal lovemaking, creates an image of seamless being before and after the angel's pronouncement, seamlessly complex and indecipherable, while at the same time publicly and socially legible. So the details of the story, its language, Eid's successful passing as male, Eid's continuities before and after transformation, all work together to create a gender representation that is ambiguous. I called it earlier gender shimmery, gender mysterious. If I am arguing, and others have argued, that gender and sexual categorization rests to a large extent on self-identification, on how one experiences themselves, then perhaps the most important question in this reading is, how does Eid experience Eid's own self? How does Eid make sense of the gendered self? And more broadly, what is the way forward into this paying attention to the self-experience of a literary character in such a way as to allow them the freedom to fully unfold or to not unfold in their own time and in their own particularity? My own attempt to listen to Eid, or to find him, or to lose him, has me looking for places where Eid articulates his own sense of gendered self. It is significant to me that Eid expresses no identification as a woman, even a masculine woman. The two times he names himself as woman, are both in the context of bemoaning the social danger that would accrue to him were he recategorized as female. The narrator tells us that, quote, she feared if it should be perceived that she were a woman, it should be to her trouble. Therefore she kept herself close and secret. We might compare this articulated self-consciousness with another and much more famous medieval character, born female, who similarly passes as male. Until oddly, Merlin shows up at the end of that story and makes her put a dress on. And that is the 13th century French character named Silence. Unlike Silence, who several times references her own female nature as determining her actions and desire, Eid acknowledges no interior nature that would help neatly to categorize her inner self, no place where Eid self-identifies as a desiring woman. I maintain that this opacity of self-identification is the terrain, perhaps the only terrain, of Eid's sense of self and gender-inflected sexual desire. Eid's desire to keep the self, quote, close and secret, permeates the text. Again and again, Eid reiterates the desire to remain sexually veiled, with gender illegible and untouched. And when they are wed, Olive responds to this desire by reaffirming that she will be Eid's wife precisely because she tells Eid, quote, you have kept yourself so truly. Even in the bedroom scenes, a place where we might expect that the intimacy of connection would extend to a kind of immediacy of self-disclosure, we still do not know what Eid desires or how Eid experiences those 15 nights of embracing and kissing. As we do not know what Olive knows, how she experiences the body and the being she touches, and what kind of desire, does it have a name, that Olive fulfills as she draws close to Eid night after night. It seems to me that allowing a trans reading of this scene, of this text, might prompt me to linger with these characters in the space of unknowing, obscurity, even namelessness, without giving in to the potentially coercive pressure to name what they do not. I am obligated to follow the injunction of Marjorie Garber, Harvard professor of early modern literature and sexuality, regarding the transvestite, to not see through this character to the real woman within, but to see Eid in all of Eid's gloriously complex selfhood, to watch what Eid does, how Eid self-discloses, but to leave the naming, the agency of self-identification, to Eid, and to the God who is also, apparently, reading her story. To respect the story's contours of public and private, body and self. After all, God intervenes precisely when Eid's body would have been laid bare to the court and to the readerly audience. God intervenes when that revelation to court and to readers would have meant Eid's death. To reserve the innermost place for Eid and that God to commune. I am compelled by the text to acknowledge that I see and interpret Eid, as Paul describes, but through a glass dimly. And what does Eid choose? Eid ultimately chooses gender and sexual opacity, an obscurity of selfhood that is at a distance from his experience of womanhood to this point. In the final analysis, Eid self-identifies not within stable gender or sexual categories, but on a trajectory across his own time. Eid inhabits the same space that Halberstam wants to open for the transgender individual, with or without hormones, those who pass, cross-dress, or otherwise defy gender norms. When she writes that transgender, quote, may be a term of relationality, it describes not simply an identity, but a relation between people, within a community, or within intimate bonds, unquote. For these subjects, Halberstam writes, quote, we need a transgender history, a method for recording the presence of gender-ambiguous subjects sensitive enough not to reduce them to either women all along or failed men. I maintain that Eid is such a character that enfleshes one moment of that transgender history and occupies that particular threshold between genders, refusing legibility or gender or sexual coherence. The story we tell about Eid, our making sense of that character now, should allow Eid to speak from within his own particular gender ambiguity, should move away from rationalizing or categorizing or moving towards representing Eid's life, quote, in the glory of all its contradictions, unquote. Not only might we come closer to capturing the incommensurable in this text, the leavings of categories that shape this particular being, but we might make space for many other gender nonconforming individuals to, quote, benefit from increased freedoms of gender expression and identity. What I've tried to do in this talk is to gesture towards a reading practice that resists flattening gender ambiguity in my encounter with a medieval being who may be read as transgender. I've tried to articulate an encounter with Eid that is more attuned to the full range of possible lives and relations for which Eid's life makes space, without participating in the text's own coercive norming by insisting on categories that, in surfacing one identification, risk the erasure of others. I do not want my reading practice to force Eid to be politically procreative in exactly the way that his queer body is narratively forced into heterosexual procreation at the text's end. Nor do I want to recreate that productive coercion in forcing Eid to make sense or to provide cohesion where Eid does not. I am, rather, advocating for another kind of reading posture that makes space for the yes and, to make sure that my own reading practice does not preclude or erase the transgendered being from having space in this story alongside other histories. Following Carolyn Dinshaw's writing about queer histories, I am trying on an attachment to the non-visible, to the fleeting or doomed or erased, and without making it visible or insisting that it account for itself. I am also gesturing towards a trans hermeneutic that leaves room for the residue, for the incommensurable, the invisible, the unnamed in gender and sexual self-experience and self-iteration. A hermeneutic that might recuperate other cross-dressed characters who pass as other genders into a reconsideration in light of trans ethics, which I would argue must be able to encounter other beings precisely in the perhaps unsettling space of unknowing. This encountering the trans figure in a posture of attentiveness does not create knowledge or certainty of categories or lexicons of being. Rather, we linger with the trans figure in order to perceive them as they are, as Carrie Howie has beautifully written, as the full fleshing out of a world of deep ironies. To linger with them in unknowing, alongside the long tradition of Christian apophatic thinkers who find unknowing the only fitting epistemology when facing a God whose being overflows the bounds of language or thought to contain her. A God who identifies with mystery and plenitude as the I am. I am reading alongside the Christian tradition that sees and unsees God simultaneously in light and also inaccessible, hid from our eyes. A Christian tradition that hears God in silence, which claims silence as the first language of God. How can a reading practice inhabit these Christian traditions? Perhaps I begin by acknowledging the limits of gender and sexual categories and the inadequacy of language to make sense of desire. Perhaps I read more like Moses on Mount Sinai, enveloped in his own cloud of unknowing, in which I allow myself to be transfigured, to be undone by what I encounter there. Perhaps it means that I read, perhaps it means that I read like Halberstam suggests, like our own community life statement suggests, quote, with a commitment to inquiry as well as pronouncement. I suggest that performing that hermeneutic or interpretive practice that I might call compassionate unknowing respects the inner place of any character, any being, as a sacred and hidden space in which they encounter the divine. Thank you.